I don't think we've ever done anything like this before, but we watched Queen of the Ring. Big wrestling fans that we are, we watched Queen of the Ring by Ash Avildsen, who's the son of John G. Avildsen, who directed Rocky and the Karate Kid trilogy and Rocky 5 and Joe. We watched Queen of the Ring. I watched it. Jake watched it. Jake couldn't be here for this. And Kevin Ford, a frequent guest, Kevin Ford, watched it. Now, we all know each other. We actually all became friends because of wrestling. I met Jake in college because we were both big wrestling fans, and we met to trade wrestling tapes. And then Kevin, we met because of our Ring of Honor fandom in the mid-aughts. But we're all friends because of wrestling, so we all watched this movie, and to different degrees, we all fucking hated it. So I've never done this before, but I actually felt offended by this movie and felt the need to jump on and talk about why it's so bad, because it's not just regular bad, and also it's a wrestling movie. And at this point, we've gotten a couple of good wrestling movies. We've gotten one great wrestling movie in Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler. We got a solid wrestling movie in Fighting With My Family. We got another very good wrestling movie in The Iron Claw. By and large, though, they're pretty bad. This one is exceptionally bad. You know what? I want to go back, though, even because wrestling movies, even when they're not so good, there's some charm in them. Like Ready to Rumble is a bad movie, but it has a lot of charm. It actually kind of sums up what WCW was as it was dying. It's a huge mess, but it's got Scott Conn in it, the son of Scott Conn's dad, and it's got David Arquette, who's a huge wrestling fan, and that comes through in the movie. I have a really hard time believing that anyone associated with Queen of the Ring, with the exception of the wrestlers in it, Mickie James, Trinity Fatu, Naomi, Camille, and Tony Storm, with the exception of those people, I have a really hard time believing that anyone in this movie actually cares about wrestling, and they definitely don't think that anyone watching knows anything about wrestling. Now, that's fine. I think it's fair to say that most people watching movies in general don't know much about wrestling, and the assumption, my assumption of their assumption is that because this is a movie about a female pioneer in wrestling in the 1930s through the 1950s, that more women who are unfamiliar with wrestling would come to see it. That's crazy to me because wrestling fans are the ones who see movies about wrestling. So, okay, what is this movie about? It's about Mildred Burke, played by Emily Bett Rickards. Her start in wrestling, which is completely overexplained to the point that it's painful. Every single aspect of how wrestling works, how it's predetermined, how matches get laid out, how the backstage works. It's all pain-receivingly spoken at the audience. And she gets into the business through Josh Lucas, who's playing Billy Wolfe. By the way, this is a true story. Billy Wolfe, who was a promoter who, despite being quite exploitative towards these women, did make wrestling in America for women a reality. And then you've got folks like Francesca Eastwood, who plays Mae Young, who wrestling fans, even modern wrestling fans, know because she was present on WWF television, WWE television in the late 90s until her death. So it's the story of Burke's rise to popularity and then her attempt to become a promoter in her own right, strike out on her own so that she could get away from the abusive Billy Wolfe. Everyone in this movie, with the exception of Walton Goggins and Francesca Eastwood, who are not doing a ton, are abysmal. It's not really their fault. The script is atrocious. Jake said this to me in a text message. It really does feel like a first draft that somehow got filmed, although then some of the direction is just baffling. The amount of times that Mildred Burke looks in the mirror when she decides she wants to do something and stares meaningfully at herself, it feels like an SNL or 30 Rock parody of a movie trailer. It's really, really hard to watch. There's a lot of really weird anachronisms in the movie. Some of the ways that wrestling is explained is more appropriate when talking about modern wrestling than it would be about wrestling at the time. The only exception being Wolfe tells Burke about shoot fights that happened in the back to determine who would be the toughest wrestler, because back in the day, the illusion of wrestling was still in the public consciousness and they were still trying to convince people that it wasn't predetermined. The assumption, and sometimes the reality, was that people would attack wrestlers to show that they're tougher than the champion. And so promoters would get wrestlers together and have them do a shoot fight in the back just to make sure that they could handle themselves. Or at least that's what wrestlers like Lou Thez, who is one of the godfathers of modern professional wrestling, said in his biography. And people of that generation have said that that's the case too. That comes up in the movie, which is like the one cool bit of wrestling knowledge that you get, although it feels fake and feels like maybe it never happened, even though it did, because the rest of the movie feels overwritten and over-explained, and like what they're telling us is just a Wikipedia entry on how professional wrestling works. Also, the music is very anachronistic and bad. And when I say music, I mean the soundtrack, because the score is fine. It feels appropriate for the era that they're depicting. And luckily, that music isn't so cheesy. You see in a lot of sort of more inexpensive B movies, They get really bad royalty-free music. Here, what I assume royalty-free or cheap royalty music, it's not terrible, but the soundtrack is awful. It's covers of songs that don't fit by bands that shouldn't have been covering these original songs. Over and over again throughout this movie, we are told, it's like basically someone looking at the camera saying, wrestling is about telling stories. And yet none of the wrestling matches in this movie, save for the final one in the climactic scene, tell any kind of a story at all. So it's major tell don't show. And the story that the final match tells, I'll just start by saying I don't really care when real life is not depicted exactly as it happened in a movie about real life. So most of the changes that were made from reality to this movie don't bother me so much. One is very strange. So first off, spoilers for this movie. I'll give you a second. If you want to click away to watch a terrible movie first, I don't recommend it. That's the crux of this. Deborah Ann Woll's character dies. In real life, that wrestler that she portrays lived to be quite old. So that's a kind of a weird change, but not one that bothered me so much because footage of a lot of these classic women's wrestling matches doesn't really exist. In large part, not in the same way it does for men, but really footage of wrestling matches from the 30s to the 50s is pretty scarce. A lot of it didn't happen on television, so I wasn't a fan of that wrestler, to say the least. How could I be? But what I found weird was that the ending of the match, this climactic match, did not match what happened in reality, and what happened in reality was quite interesting because the ending of this match as a no contest meant that the Women's World Wrestling Championship was held up, and that the wrestler that Camille was portraying went on to become the NWA Women's Champion, and Mildred Burke created the WWA Women's Championship, which was an important belt defended in All Japan Wrestling, which is a women's organization in Japan. And it's especially strange because Burke's work in Japan is referenced in the cards that go up to explain what happened to folks. They mention Burke went to Japan and helped make women's wrestling big there, which it's still pretty popular there. Strange. I don't know. Overall, also just like the production was very bad. This felt like a TV movie that came out in 1989 with the bad music, just the crappy visuals that were used. It has that sort of sheen over it, and the camera moves and fades out too quickly from scenes in a way that you would expect from a 90s or 80s TV movie. So it's surprising that this got a theatrical release because it feels like something that would stream straight to Tubi. And not only did it look bad, but it was afraid of itself. So it brings up these big themes like segregation. There are black women's wrestlers who show up. Does it really engage with that issue? No. About 2 scenes after these women are introduced, they go to a hotel where the black women are not allowed to stay, and Mildred Burke rents out the whole hotel so they can stay there. Segregation solved, I guess. They never bring it up again, except for in the epilogue to say that Babs Wingo won the first interracial women's championship shortly after the events of the movie, which brings up another issue, which is that women-on-women wrestling was banned. That's sort of a lingering plot point throughout the movie that never gets addressed head on, but is sort of mentioned quietly on the periphery throughout. Oh, this state now legalized it, and this state now legalized it. And at the end of the movie, when for a second they're upset that this big climactic match can't happen in Madison Square Garden because New York hasn't legalized it yet, at the end of the movie they mention it in the epilogue that California legalized it in the 60s and New York legalized it in the 70s. It doesn't really affect the plot because at the beginning of the movie, when women start wrestling each other, they just do it even though it's illegal, and then it becomes legal off screen in a montage. By the way, this montage that happens kind of early on in the movie is the only part of the movie that has any kind of style at all. It's in black and white and it moves pretty quickly. It's pretty cool. That's it. That's the only reason this is a 1-star movie instead of a half-star movie. And now, just let me wrap this up with like my minor quibbles and what Jake and Kevin's quibbles. I think, on the one hand, it is reasonable to believe that Cara Buono was the right age to play Mildred Burke's mother. I think in real life, the 2 actresses are 20 years apart, but they look in the movie like they're the same age. This is a visual medium. We needed to believe that they were mother and daughter. They look like sisters, so that didn't work for me. Meanwhile, 20 years pass in this movie, and the only person who ages is Billy Wolfe. And, of course, Mildred Burke's son, because he has to go from being a baby to being a 20-year-old. None of the women and none of the other men age. Gorgeous George, who, oh my God, can I talk about, this is actually pretty important. This is not a minor quibble. This is a major quibble. This is an SEO movie. What do I mean by that? An SEO movie in that there are 2 characters in this film that are only there, not because they serve a purpose in helping other characters realize character growth or to move the plot forward, but because having those characters in the movie are a way for people who are searching for real people that they might know would stumble upon this movie. And those 2 characters are Gorgeous George, who we see his transformation from boring curtain jerker to the charismatic, flamboyant main eventer that influenced Ric Flair, and I guess Muhammad Ali, according to the epilogue, Billy Graham, dozens of famous wrestlers. We see him in it, although he doesn't do much. I guess at one point he gives Burke some money, but I, at that point, was so tuned out of the movie, it didn't seem to affect what was happening. And I didn't think the guy portraying Gorgeous George was convincing at all, like even in the slightest. And the other one is much more nefarious. So Mickie James, this is twofold. This is SEO so that the actress, who is a pretty famous female professional wrestler today, and the woman she's portraying. So Mickie James is in this movie for about 15 seconds, and you wouldn't know it unless you saw it in the credits, but she is portraying the Fabulous Moolah. Now, this is really nefarious because the Fabulous Moolah was a huge part of this era of women's wrestling, but no one wants to touch it because she was allegedly, and I don't know if you have to say allegedly about people who have passed away, she pimped out other women's wrestlers. So they weren't touching that. That wasn't part of the story, even though that aspect would have made for an interesting story, but not in this movie because this movie can't handle stuff like that and would not be able to handle stuff like that. So, okay, fine, you don't want to touch it. Don't put her in the movie. She's only there so that both the Fabulous Moolah's name and Mickie James' name can be associated with the movie and get caught in search engines when people search for them. I think that's really gross. Now, I wouldn't say that dampened my enjoyment of the movie because I wasn't enjoying this movie, but it's something that I hadn't thought about before, and now I'm sure I'm going to notice it in other things. You know, these things aren't Easter eggs. They're SEO eggs. They're seeds to be planted so that the internet can catch these things. This is as much a symptom of the bad direction that the industry is going in as people needing 1 million Instagram followers to get cast, and things like Staircase Studios doing their totally AI movies. Just a couple more like little minor quibbles. They did this thing where they gave Billy Wolfe a cauliflower ear. Now, that's a nice little Easter egg. No one points at him and goes, you have a cauliflower ear. So it's nice that they just put that there to show that he was an old wrestler. They get hit in the ear. They get cauliflower ear. It was a nice, subtle little thing. It just looked like crap. It was so distracting because it looked plastic. Like this guy has a plastic thing on his ear the entire movie. I want to say what Jake and Kevin's were. Jake just hates Josh Lucas, the guy who played Billy Wolfe. So that needs to be said. And apparently there was a Scott Hall quote about triumph over adversity. Scott Hall is also sort of recently departed and a big part of most wrestling fans our age fandom. And I guess they used it so that the bad guy could threaten someone, which he found disrespectful, and frankly, I agree. And then Kevin brought up that the movie tries to tackle too much, and in doing so tackles nothing, which I also agree with. I think I mentioned that earlier. Everything gets like 5 seconds before it gets resolved, or it gets ignored. It's pathetic. He didn't like the changes from reality. I guess the alligator clutch that Burke uses in the movie is not what the alligator clutch is in real life. Why do that? It's baffling. Just kind of makes it feel like the filmmakers don't know wrestling. But he did like the lead performance, which I did not. In fact, I only thought that Walton Goggins and Francesca Eastwood were any good at all. And also Francesca Eastwood, not that this is so important, is the only person who looked like her real life counterpart. So that's it. Highly don't recommend. If you want a good wrestling movie, there's The Wrestler. If you want a solid wrestling movie about women's wrestling, there's Fighting With My Family. Or, and I didn't even like this that much, but Queen of Villains, the Netflix show about female Japanese wrestling, is much more compelling than this. Good luck to everybody out there. Movies like this exist.